Yes, it's been a while since we covered a headstock repair. It's probably time. This one's a doozy, and it has a pretty interesting background story. This is from a local music store. It appeared at the counter one day in its present condition, and someone was looking at getting it repaired. The thing is, a couple of years earlier, this guitar was stolen right off the wall from that same music store. Don't try and bring back stolen goods to their place of origin. That's not ever going to go well. This happens to be a custom shop. Gibson Les Paul Custom in white. Sort of Randy Rhoads-esque. Yeah, so worth a pretty penny. And they got to try and rescue it. Gibson doesn't really make dating their custom shop output all that easy. There isn't a place online where you can just plug in the number and it'll tell you. Although decoding the serial number here suggests that this was made in either probably 2009 or maybe 2019. Kind of hard to tell based on how its life was on the lam there. Could have lived hard, or it could just be pretty well preserved for something that's 15 years old. Anyway, it is what it is, and it needs fixing. So this is not the easiest headstock break. It's maybe not as bad as some, but it's still pretty challenging. The main thing is the neck shaft here feathers away to nothing right behind the nut. I mean, seriously, it becomes paper thin back here. And it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle trying to get these two parts to go back together. We have the truss rod overlay strip here, which is kind of loose and has also broken at a funny angle. Yeah, looking into the truss rod adjustment cavity, there's a piece of mahogany end grain which is blown right out into it, and it's also holding the headstock overlay off the edge of the front surface of the headstock. So that's got to go. Just a lot of alignment issues. And no doubt there's going to be some fret work at the end of this. In terms of strength and structure, I don't think there's a whole lot to worry about here because this is a very long angled joint. It's basically a scarf joint at this point. Lots of surface area for glue. And hopefully there's enough funny stuff going on here that it acts like its own alignment device and keys itself together. I'll try and pry out that piece. Ooh, I see the truss rod overlay comes out too. I think it would be much easier to just leave that out and try and fit it in after the rest of the neck is glued. It introduces a lot of complications. Without that intruding piece, the overlay sits down nice again. I can glue that up. Just a little bit of tight bond forced in there, and then a well padded clamping system here to get those parts locked down. With some of the interfering wood out of the way now, the brake fits together rather well. There are some voids and missing material, of course, but that can be replaced. I'll apply a generous coating of paste wax to the threads of the truss rod so they won't be befouled with glue. I'll be employing surgical tubing to clamp the parts, and in order to try and keep the fretboard in one plane, I'm using a radius sanding block as a platform. This also has some uprights fastened to it to help in applying pressure with bar clamps. You can see there's a rather large missing portion near the nut. That wasn't included in the bag of parts, so it must be on the floor in someone's basement. Glue has been applied, tubing has been wrapped. You can see that there's a small fixture clamped to the headstock. That gives me some inline clamping power that will force the head down into the neck. Basically, I don't want a big gap behind the nut. It closes those parts up. There's a big old missing chunk on one side of the neck, so I'll break out one of my routing templates here. This has got a hinged portion which allows me to clamp to the headstock, and on the other side I will apply some tape and actually physically glue it to the neck shaft. I've got some painter's tape on both surfaces to be glued, and I've also propped up this end of the routing jig with an extra piece of wood and put on some cork as padding there so that it would kind of rest against the tape and give bigger contact surface for the glue. Using a light touch and some careful balancing, I can hog out the material. This is really the most accurate way of doing it. I've seen people try to cut these mortises by hand, and gosh, you got to be good, because the lines have to be perfectly straight and vertical. And I don't know if there's a way of doing this accurately enough without some machine help. This is as deep as I feel comfortable routing. You can see there's still a void in there, which I'm going to pack full of epoxy putty. The little square thing is actually a positioning device which Gibson used to hold the fingerboard in the correct alignment. A nice piece of hard maple which I'll plane up to fill one of the gaping holes. A little scribble mark there denoting the true corner is my tribute to Frank Klaus, for those of you who remember his wonderful series of videos for fine woodworking. Choppity chop with a sharp chisel. Get that glued in place. It's a true wrapper's delight. You can see that I've gone ahead and filled all the other fissures with some 2-part epoxy putty. This is good strong stuff, and it carves almost like wood when it's done. Use my spoke shave and my knife. Now I'm into sanding. Now I have to sand down all the fill and make it level. I have to go in both directions, following the curve of the neck and also the straight lines, the longitudinal aspect of the neck like this as well, to keep things straight and fair. I'll saturate the surface of the epoxy putty and all the little tiny fissures with some very thin super glue. This will act as a sealer and also make sure that it'll wick into any remaining open spaces. And that gets sanded back as well. Not entirely sure what's going on with this neck here, because I've got it sanded down. You can see that it's like I sanded through a color layer onto a clear layer, which is sitting on top of another layer of white. Very strange. I'll mask off the edge of the fingerboard. The binding there is a different color from the body of the neck. Spraying on a quick sealer coat. You know, I've had really mixed luck with white lacquer pigment additives. They're a challenge. Some of them don't seem to dry. As luck would have it, Tamiya makes a pretty close match for this color. This is a lacquer designed for plastic models. I use the black version a lot on Gibson headstocks. This seemed like a good choice. The important caveat for model paints: exceedingly light coats. Just a bare mist and then let it dry. After every few coats, I'll lightly sand back, trying not to develop too heavy a layer of the paint, because as the thickness increases, the longer it takes to dry or cure. It will eventually get good and hard, but it seems to take longer than other pigments. Black and red, for instance, dry much faster, it seems, than the white. Don't quite know why that is, what the inhibition is. You can see there are still telegraphing areas of places where the cracks are. Now here's something interesting. I've put on several coats and sanded back a couple of times to try and get things good and level, but I'm having a problem. One of the glue seams keeps reappearing as this sort of black hairline, a fissure or a tight little canyon, almost as if it's resisting the finish. So I thought maybe I can fill it with some Glue Boost, which is super glue that's designed specifically for working with finishes. Well, whatever solvent is in that ate right into the paint, liquefying it to the point where it began to run. So I'm sanding back again, and I'm thinking about perhaps using a shot of lacquer to act as a barrier. It's, for some reason, it's always white paint jobs that do this for me. You know, things go wrong in weird ways. First of all, white shows off every little imperfection or dust mote, anything that falls into it. And it doesn't seem to behave quite like other finishes either. It's very strange. I mean, you really want the white surface to be perfect before we put a coat of lacquer on top and try and buff it. Because if there's any inconsistencies, you could buff the top coat perfectly level and absolutely shiny, but you're looking through it onto a surface that will kind of show off shadows and things. It's almost like looking into like a calm lake or something, and you can see the topography going on down below. So this really has to be smooth. Yeah, the glue boost has really eaten into the surface here. It's coming off in little threads. After sanding, I degreased the area really well with alcohol, and here I'm painting the color directly into the fissure using a brush. Again, trying not to develop too thick a layer in this area. I just want to basically do a drop fill here. After some drying time, put on a couple coats of lacquer. It's looking pretty good. I'll peel the mask off the binding. Eventually I'll have to sort of feather this edge in because there is an appreciable layer of paint that's, you know, wider than the thickness of the binding. So after it gets hard, I'll have to sand it down. It's the same with the back of the headstock. I thought I was being clever doing a sort of stinger effect, but the line of demarcation is too obvious because of the thickness of the paint. It leaves a shadow that is visible, even though it's white on white. So I thought that a fine misting of paint in the area might help to transition between the neck and the original lacquer. The lacquer is also yellowed to different extents all over the guitar, so it's a tough match. I'll try and knock down the thickness of the line with some sanding. Then I'll remask the decal and give it the lightest little spritzing in that area. And yes, I think that does look better. Okay, I'm putting some hardware on, just so that I can get some noise out of this thing for you. If I don't, people will complain. In truth, it's got to sit for a long time before I can level and really buff it out. There's going to be some sinkage probably, some touch-up, but it really has to contract and really cure. There's an area here on the edge that you can see is much too thick because the extra material slumped against the tape. I've got to feather that down, but I can't do it now because this won't sand cleanly into powder. If I try, it's just going to roll up and tear. It's still very tender. Gold hardware. It looks good for a year or two. But like our friend Robert Frost says, nothing gold can stay. I think I like the way nickel ages best. Seems to age the most gracefully. Black hardware can really look kind of unsightly too sometimes as it ages. Okay, I got all the parts, seemingly, including the half-moon washer, but no actual truss rod nut. I have to dip into the stash. Why, even stolen guitars need polishing. I somehow managed to guesstimate exactly the right amount of truss rod tension. Very impressed with myself. Just got it strung up and was ready to start playing and realized this is where the guitar landed. Switching pickups is a bit of a hassle, so I guess I'm ordering a part.